Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 61 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the Ottawa Senators and lost by a score of 5-3. The last time these two teams met was one of the best performances for the Sharks this season, and yet they would end up losing that game anyway. And so, looking for a little bit of revenge here tonight. On top of that, the last game that the Sharks played against the Montreal Canadiens just a couple of days ago was one in which the Sharks were certainly hoping and feeling as though they deserved a better result in than the 4-3 overtime loss they got. And so with these factors combined, the Sharks were definitely gunning for a victory here tonight, and they looked like a team on a mission to claim it in this first period, as they were executing at a much higher level than what the Senators were prepared for, which gave them the majority of the shots and the majority of the chances. This first period was primarily played near or within the Senators' defensive zone, and yet hockey, it can be funny at times, as even though the Sharks were inarguably the better team in this opening period, it was the Senators who would actually score the only goal here. Shane Pinto on the shorthanded breakaway to make it 1-0, and this really seemed to take the wind out of the Sharks' sails. This has been a frustrating season, and this was just yet another moment to add on to the top of the pile, and so this game really flipped on its head in the second period, where now suddenly the Senators were looking much better, and the Sharks couldn't even connect a simple pass. And yet again, hockey being its unpredictable self, even though this was in my opinion the worst period for the Sharks in this game, it was one in which they outscored the Senators 2-0 thanks to a fortunate bounce off of his skate on the Tyler Toffoli power play goal, and then a fortunate bounce off of a stick on the Timothy Liljegren power play goal, making it a 2-1 game after 40 minutes. But this gave the Sharks a dreaded third period lead, and as much as I would like to be saying that as a joke, it is in fact not a joke, as this has become a very serious issue for the Sharks this season. They have lost more games than they have won this year when they've taken a lead into the third period. Most teams will be winning like 3 of every 4 times in this situation. There's even a small handful of teams that are perfect when they take a lead into the third period. So the fact that statistically you expect the Sharks to lose when in this position is really, really a bad look. And it's exactly what they did 2 days ago against the Canadiens. It is exactly what they did 2 days prior to that against the Winnipeg Jets. And it is exactly what continues here tonight, where they blow yet another third period lead here against Ottawa. It starts off as the Sharks had taken a penalty late in the second period and then took one early in the third on the delay of game, where Tkachuk buries it on the 5-on-3, and then an unfortunate bounce going against the Sharks this time. Tim Stützle takes advantage and makes it 3-2 Ottawa. But at this point, the game is not put away, as much as the Sharks are obviously really upset with how this one ends up going yet again. They're not completely out of it. They can take a look at these 2 goals and say, well, it's a 5-on-3, it's an unlucky bounce, we can still come back. But it is this David Perron goal that ends up being the true backbreaker, because there is no excuses to be given here. This is just simply a huge mistake being made by the Sharks. Now, who's going to end up taking the individual blame for this? I'm not entirely sure, because what happens here is this is an extremely ill-advised change by the Sharks' fourth line, which leaves a huge portion of the ice completely wide open for the Senators to rush it back in and David Perron to score what ends up being the eventual game winner in this one. I don't know if it is the fourth line who elects to change at a horrific timing, or if it is the coaching staff who actually encouraged this line change, which would be a really bad move from them. But somebody obviously is at fault here, because this was a really bad look for the team. Now, at that point, the Sharks really kind of brought it back a little bit. Score effects obviously helping to really take back control of this third period, but nothing else doing in the goal-scoring department until the Sharks actually pull the goaltender with about 3 minutes to go. That proceeds, few seconds run down, and eventually the Senators end up taking a penalty as they trip up Alex Wennberg entering the zone, and that gives the Sharks a 6-on-4. And this is really where the big controversy of this game occurs. In a puck battle along the boards, Jake Sanderson comes in, engages in a bit of physical contact, small cross check to Tyler Toffoli, who maybe takes exception to that, and ends up catching Sanderson in an extremely vulnerable position with a cross check to the back of the neck, or maybe slightly below that, and that ends up dropping Sanderson like a stone to the ice, and the Sharks already up 2 players in the 6-on-4, now up 3 with Sanderson completely out of the play. They are able to execute a tic-tac-toe goal for Will Smith to bury it and bring this one to within one. And the major question is how Toffoli doesn't end up getting called for a penalty in this situation, especially with the puck in this area and the fact that it leads directly to a goal against just a few seconds later. Definitely a surprise why the referees don't end up calling this. We have questioned the officiating in each of these last couple of games. It was crazy how the Sharks did not end up with a single power play in the previous one against the Montreal Canadiens, but it turns out that the officiating here in the NHL, it's a very, very tough job that I don't think I would be able to do a better job of it. The game just moves at such a fast pace that actually trying to keep up is not an easy thing to do. This is one in which it is a real head scratcher, considering, again, the puck was in that area. I don't know how the refs missed it, but perhaps they did not think it was as serious as it actually ended up being, and so the Sharks were able to take advantage because of that. And so the next question becomes, well, if nothing happens in this game, will there be any supplemental discipline out of it? This is something that the NHL actually does take seriously. Usually if a player doesn't end up getting penalized in the game, the NHL wants to dish out something after it. So this could end up just being a fine, perhaps, which is really not going to move the needle either which way, as players make a lot more money than the actual fines end up being, but it could also theoretically end up being a suspension. I imagine not any more than just a singular game, considering Toffoli has a pretty clean slate. He's not known to be a dirty player at all, and I don't think that this was a particularly egregious intentional cross-check. Obviously, he did want to cross-check Sanderson, but I don't think it was supposed to be in as dangerous of an area as he got him in, so I'm going to give Toffoli the benefit of the doubt here, but it is quite clear that it was a dangerous play, and so I would not be surprised if the NHL ends up giving him something. However, the Sharks end up not being able to take advantage of this break for themselves, as the Senators would capitalize with an empty netter just a few seconds after and put the game away anyway, 5-3. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks top line of Celebrini, Eklund, and Toffoli. To start off with Macklin Celebrini, it was actually a bit of a rough beginning to this game, which is somewhat surprising because the Sharks as a whole were really rolling in that first period, but Celebrini himself a little bit quiet in those first 20 minutes, but he definitely brought it back as this game went on. The second and third period, he was significantly better and ended up being one of the Sharks' better forwards in this one. He picks up a couple of points here with a secondary assist on both the Will Smith goal that made it 4-3, as well as the Tyler Toffoli goal that originally made it 1-1. So he's picking up a couple of points in that Calder race that has suddenly become a lot more competitive, with both Mishkov and Hudson really beginning to rack up the points here as of late. So Celebrini needing to keep up in that area, but ends up being a really solid game for him. Also had a couple of really strong looks in the shooting department. When it comes to his two line mates here, I'll start off with Willie Meckland, who I actually thought had a very effective game in this one. He actually was looking really good in the first period, Celebrini lagging behind a little bit, which is the unusual case here. Usually it's flipped the other way around, but Eklund I thought worked it very well below the goal line. You know, he usually loves to go into those fighting moments, and he has mixed success, I would say, in those areas below the goal line. Sometimes he's able to really break free, sometimes not so much. This was one of those games where he was able to get those opportunities, so I really liked what Eklund was able to do. Had some decent passes in this game as well. And then when it comes to Tyler Toffoli, obviously I talked about the controversy surrounding him, so there's not really any other reason to dwell on that. When it comes to his actual play here, I actually thought Toffoli started this game off exceptionally well. The first period, it looked like it was going to be one of those games where Toffoli really showed up and came here to play. He would end up scoring a goal, of course, on this one. That made it 1-1, which was nice to see, his 22nd of the year, but he definitely fell off a little bit as the second and third period came along. Didn't end up making a huge impact in this game, but not the worst game for Toffoli, I guess. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, we have Wenberg with Zetterlund and Will Smith. We'll start off with Will Smith, who has kind of been a very big talking point here as of late, because he's just been consistently racking up the points for the Sharks, and that continued here in this game. He picks up the primary assist on the Tyler Toffoli goal, as well as the goal here in the 6-on-4 situation, which was nice to see. Another couple of points added to his total, but he was generally playing rather well here tonight. He started off this one immediately off the face-off here as Mario Ferraro flips this puck into the zone. Brady Tkachuk, a player who is difficult to take the puck from and is very heavy on his stick, plays a very physical style of game. He gloves this one out of the air, puts it down to the ice, and Will Smith comes in, picks his pocket instantly, and then feeds a very quick pass to Wenberg for a great shot on goal. This is like 6 seconds into the game. Will Smith really came to play. Now, it wasn't a perfect game from Smith. There were a couple of shakier moments, him trying to make a play that didn't end up working out, but all in all, I thought there were a lot of positives here. I will also mention what ends up happening at the end of the game, because obviously when you take a look at this Senators empty net, you look at Will Smith up at the blue line, he mishandles this one, and that allows that opportunity. That puts this game away. I'm not really going to blame Smith too much on that. In fact, just a couple of minutes prior to that, Smith playing at that left side point as a right shooting player, it's not an easy spot to be in. It's hard to keep those pucks alive, but he was actually doing a really good job of it twice in that 6-on-5 prior to the penalty being taken. He had to make a really difficult play in a tight space on that backhand, and he was able to do it with success. And so him having a bit of a bobble there, maybe the puck bouncing on him, I'm not going to put too much blame him when he was previously showing a lot of success just a couple of minutes earlier. So I think all in all, very positive outing for Smith. When it comes to his line mates, Alex Wennberg, I thought also continues to be such fantastic support for this 19-year-old rookie on the Sharks. Wennberg just really doing a lot to help out this line. He was the beneficiary of a couple of those great passes. I mentioned the one just a few seconds into this game, but I believe Wennberg was set up by Smith like 3 different times in the upper slot. Obviously not like an extremely high danger area, but still great opportunities to shoot at for sure. And then generally, I still thought Wennberg also played rather well defensively. All in all, a really good game for this duo, but the odd man out was once again Fabian Zetterlund. I was a fan of Zetterlund at the beginning of that Montreal Canadiens game. I thought the first half of it was really good, but then he kind of tapered off a little bit in the end, and I was hoping that moving forward we'll see more of that first 30-minute Zetterlund in that last game compared to the last one, but here tonight I just didn't really feel as though he was particularly effective, and considering the rest of the Sharks' top 6 is pulling their weight more often than not. Even Tyler Toffoli, who I feel as though at times can be a little bit invisible, is at the very least contributing on the score sheet with goals and assists. Zetterlund not being able to find as much success in that area. We really need to see him kind of rebound a little bit, or perhaps the Sharks maybe look to make a change. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, we have Goodrow with Dellandrea and Cunnin. So these 3 players left together. It was, a potential disaster in the previous game against Montreal, but it ended up being okay because the Sharks actually looked rather good in that one. Here tonight, obviously, another potential disaster. You're always going to have that kind of train heading towards you, but the Sharks seem to have dodged it yet again. There was obviously that one shift in which they get caught on the ice for an extended period of time in their own zone. There was like a good 2 or 3 minute shift that Cunnin ended up being in particular, because Goodrow and Dellandrea got to get off the ice for a change. That obviously didn't look great, but they actually created a couple of decent offensive opportunities. Cunnin had a couple of great looks there in that third period that could have potentially brought the game to within 1 earlier than what the Will Smith goal came around. So not the end of the world here tonight. Still, it was a potentially dangerous game, I guess you could say. There were certainly moments where they faltered a little bit, but all in all, I'd say decent enough for all 3 of these players. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we have Graf, Sturm, and Kostin. I already mentioned the big mistake being made on that David Perron goal where they go off for that line change. It's hard to really put blame onto these 3 players when I'm not fully familiar with what occurred, because indeed, as I mentioned, Warsofsky could be just as much in the wrong in this spot if he really was there encouraging those 3 players to come off. This was a fourth line that looked pretty good to begin the last game against the Montreal Canadiens, but kind of fell off a little bit. In particular, Klim Kostin had done exactly that, and I thought maybe Kostin would lose his lineup spot to Carl Grundstrom, but he's given another chance, and it actually does work out a little bit for the Sharks. I thought Kostin had a much better game here tonight. Nothing extremely impressive. He didn't really have to have those Kostin moves that we had seen a couple months ago at this point prior to his injury, where he could actually contribute offensively somewhat, but he definitely wasn't a huge liability on the ice at times like he was in that last game against Montreal, so that is an improvement and a positive. When it comes to Colin Graf, I actually thought we saw some really strong offensive flashes here tonight from Graf, at least 3 or 4 moments in which he made a really smart play in the offensive zone to set up someone like Kostin or someone like Sturm for a decent opportunity. So I mentioned earlier on that perhaps the Sharks could look to make a change in their top 6, with Fabian Zetterlund maybe not doing as great of a job of keeping up with both Wennberg and Smith. If that was going to be elected a move from Ryan Warsofsky, Graf could be a possible player to be bumped up. We had seen him originally when the Sharks called him up, play up in this group in more of an offensive role, either with Zetterlund and Granlund or with Smith and Celebrini. It didn't really have a ton of success, and he has certainly found more so of a home in more of this bottom six type of role, but could he perhaps be ready with the offensive flair we have seen from him in these last couple of games for another look in that top six? I certainly wouldn't be against it. And then when it comes to Nico Sturm, all in all, as per usual for Sturm, pretty solid, not really much to criticize. On the defensive side of things, we have the Sharks' top pairing of Wallman being joined by Timothy Liljegren. So indeed, Henry Thrun is injured for this particular game. I'm not entirely sure how long-term this was. I still would believe that it's probably not going to be a very long time, but he is missing tonight. And so Liljegren, who I didn't really think was particularly great against Montreal, does get the bump up here, likely because your only other right shot defenseman is Jack Thompson, who is just stepping back into the lineup, so you probably don't want to put him into that spot. And it is likely that Warsofsky wanted to maintain the Ferraro-Mukhamadullin pairing because of its success that it had in that Montreal game. So Liljegren was basically just the choice because there were no other options here. And honestly, it does work out for the Sharks. This first pairing was rather solid. We'll start off with Jake Wallman, who I do think had a pretty good game. He was certainly tested in the sort of emotion department. There was a lot of physical back and forth between him and Brady Tkachuk. And one thing that I have criticized Jake Wallman for in the past is not being able to control his emotions in some of these situations, but I actually thought he was very level-headed here tonight, did a pretty good job, even drew a penalty against Tkachuk as well in that second period, so credit to him in that area. One thing that I do want to see Wallman improve on is his shot selection. We know that Jake Wallman is single-handedly trying to keep the slap shot alive in the NHL, but there's a reason why this has been pretty phased out over these last few years, and why most players don't usually elect to just wind up and fire while holding the puck. It's because you sacrifice accuracy for power, and these days players are so good at actually getting in shooting lanes and so good at blocking shots that you're not usually going to be able to find an opening for a slap shot to get through. And yet Jake Wallman relies on this type of shot so heavily in his game, and more often than not, it doesn't actually find much success. I'd like to see him be a little bit smarter with his shot choice, and sometimes just use a wrist shot more often than not, which is what most defensemen have evolved to doing in the NHL these days, again, for the aforementioned reasons. When it comes to his defensive partner, Timothy Liljegren, again, I mentioned this did work out as a selection. He was not very good against Montreal. There were maybe a couple of small mistakes here tonight, but all in all, I thought Liljegren did some pretty decent things, and he managed to score, which I guess was nice to see, even if it was on a pretty fortunate bounce for himself. On the Sharks' second pairing, we have Ferraro and Mukhamadullin again. I was singing the high praises of Mario Ferraro in the last game against Montreal, and he really carried that into this game. His first period was, again, really, really spectacular. There began to have some mistakes creep into his game in the second period especially, and maybe a little bit at times in the third period. But all in all, I do think Mario Ferraro still ended up playing rather well. He managed to recover from the mistakes that he did make, and so it was, again, a good but maybe not as great game as Ferraro, but he has been trending upwards a little bit after these last couple of games, perhaps with some pressure from the trade deadline coming up in these next few days. When it comes to his defensive partner, Shakir Mukhamadullin, I was also somewhat of a fan of what Mukhamadullin did. It felt as though he usually had the right idea for what play to make. It just felt as though at times the execution was actually off. Moments in which he goes for like a backhand pass, but he just doesn't put enough juice on it, so it doesn't reach its intended target, or maybe he rims the puck around the zone, but he ends up putting too much onto it, and so it gets out and it misses the Sharks player. It puts him in too much of a tough spot to actually pick it up and carry it with possession. So I like that Mukhamadullin seems to be in the right spot. He seems to be making the right choice. It's just about really improving and actually executing. It kind of reminds me back of Will Smith at the beginning of this season, where he just seemed to be struggling at times just holding pucks and fanning on shots. He has gotten a lot better, and I imagine Mukhamadullin will follow a very similar pathway. It seems as though he has continued to build up trust from the coaching staff, where Warsofsky is giving him more and more tough minutes in these last couple of games. When it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, we have Vlasic and Thompson. I guess the big sort of standout from this third pairing was that moment that I mentioned in the second period where they get caught on the ice for a good 3 minutes plus. Thompson and Vlasic really laboring by the end of this, but the good news, the Sharks did not get scored on in that particular spot. I actually thought Thompson played a relatively decent game outside of that one singular shift. It seemed as though he was actually, fighting for his space in front of the net decently well, making extremely extremely simple plays. There wasn't really a ton to be excited about in Thompson's game, but all in all, I thought he was decent. And then when it comes to Marc-Edouard Vlasic, really strong start to this one. He had a few shifts in that first period where I thought he made some solid plays. It fell off a little bit as it went on, but still not the worst. And then finally, we have the Sharks goaltender Vitek Vanacek, a game in which he does end up letting in 4 goals here, just as his goaltending tandem duo Georgiev did the other night against the Montreal Canadiens, going from these goals point by point. This first one from Shane Pinto, it's on a breakaway here, shorthanded, so it's hard to really put a ton of blame onto him, but it is one of those situations where the Sharks are so dominant in the first period up to that moment that you would like to see your goaltender actually come up with the big save and pretty much the singular chance that the Ottawa Senators even got in that opening period. Then we take a look at the Tkachuk goal. This is a 5-on-3 situation. It does seem to be a clean shot that beats him. It may have deflected. I'm not entirely sure. You can kind of go either way on whether or not you blame Vanacek here. The Stützle goal, obviously, this is just an unfortunate bounce. Not really much to say. And then the Perron goal, also just really, really bad play in front of Vanacek here by the Sharks defensively with that line change. So all in all, I would say Vanacek, not a great game for him. Not terrible either. Kind of middle of the pack. Not fully his fault, but he certainly didn't help the team. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday, where they'll be taking on the Toronto Maple Leafs. So again, yet another matchup against a Canadian team. The Maple Leafs are, of course, right near the top of the Eastern Conference standings compared to some of the more middle of the pack teams the Sharks have played in their last couple, like Ottawa and Montreal. So the challenge will definitely be there. Can the Sharks actually maintain some decent level of play that they have had, or will they be on a little bit more on the back foot? I guess we'll find out. Hopefully they can finally pick up that victory. That it feels as though it's a long time coming here, since they've only won, I believe, 1 in their last 15. Class dismissed.